Okay. Okay. Welcome, my dear friends. So first of all, I would like to introduce Professor Yosef Agassi. He has been very kind to us, and this is one of the interviews that we have been doing with him at his home, usually, and uploading it to status. Welcome our dear friend General. So now it's even easier. General Bill Cohen. A little about each of you so that the two of you get to know each other a little better, and the audience later will be able to get to know each of you better. Professor Yosef Agassi is a recognized world leader in philosophy. He's considered the philosopher of Israel. He has written more than 20 books and more than 500 articles. And Dr. General Bill Cohen is a combat. He flew. He is a general in the American Air Force, but in addition, he was a volunteer in the Israeli Air Force during the Yom Kippur War. He was a student of Peter Drucker, who is considered the father of modern management. Professor Agassi has written about so many subjects that I cannot even mention all of them. General Bill Cohen has written so many books and articles focused on leadership and management. And the topic today that we are going to have, I know, a great conversation about is leadership. And since I have adopted Professor Agassi as my teacher recently, and he taught me that when I come, I have to come with questions. So I suggest that I will start with a question. What do you think are the major challenges of leaders nowadays? Who would like to start?
Don't always for it at once, right?
Okay. So I will ask Professor Agassi to start. Would you like to start, Professor Agassi?
Sure. The first question on any agenda is that of survival. How can we secure the survival of the human race?
All these simple questions.
Yeah, very easy. Yes, I know.
And do you agree, Bill?
That's most definitely an important question, and certainly as regard leadership. I don't know, but the question about leadership, I guess I should answer something that I know something about. And so I would say that I'm not sure it has to do with the survival of the human race, but leadership is not new. I mean, it's quite old. And even though we go under all kinds of very nice names nowadays, servant leadership and so forth, all of these, as Drucker used to point out, are quite old and have been around for several thousand years. And so I don't know whether there are modern changes, although certainly leadership is so powerful since it can affect so many people at so many different levels. It certainly is something of importance, I think.
Yeah, I would like to give a concrete example.
So, thank you.
If you allow me to give a concrete example, my country,
Sure, of
Israel,
course.
my country in Israel is a marvelous place and with tremendous prospects, but on a suicide track. That is to say, there's no question in my mind, if Israel continues its current policies, it is doomed to be destroyed. As a country, I don't know what the population will do, but as a country, it is doomed to be destroyed. And I know what is needed to save Israel from its current impossible situations. And it's a very simple, very easy thing, and that is to declare national mobilization. I don't know if you know, Israel has a military service which is obligatory by law for men and women, and this law is not followed. And it is, in my opinion, that if Israel would follow the law and impose military service on all its sectors, things would change overnight. The fact is there are two weak minorities in Israel, each of them 20%. One is the non-Jews and one is the Jews, the religious Jews, that is. And both don't serve in the army. And I think if they were to serve in the army, things would change overnight. But I don't know how to start working on this. I am utterly helpless and unable to do anything in Israel. And if you can advise me how to be able to try to move things in that direction, I would be eternally grateful.
Well, I don't know. Whether I can advise you, Professor, but I have my worries about my country also. Now, although I have fought for Israel and happy to do so, and my own country is things are so crazy here now that I feel like the same thing. I can divide it into two halves. Unfortunately, your half is more understandable, but in mine, I mean, something is totally, I think, is totally new, at least in my lifetime. And I thought I was going to be the oldest guy in the world, but I find I'm 84 right now, so I am younger yet. But in my lifetime of being raised here in the United States, and I was born not in Jerusalem, but in Baltimore, Maryland, I have never seen anything like this before. I mean, we always had, for example, two major parties, Democrats and Republicans. But we were always friends, and we'd always joked about elections. And after an election, the loser would congratulate the winner for a tremendous job in campaign and so forth. And right now, for the first time in my life, we are at each other's throats, and it really is distressing to me. So I am also fearful. I hope that we are able to weather this thing, but I'm certainly not in a position to advise anyone else, because I don't know what I'm very worried about what goes on here. And well, the future is the future, but it's an unfortunate situation. And I'm sorry to hear that, what you just said about what's going on in Israel. I mean, I lived in Israel for 3 years, my wife and I. My wife is an Israeli, although we did not meet in Israel. We met because she happened to be going to the university in Chicago the Air Force sent me for a master's degree in those days. I'm a West Pointer, so I had only a bachelor's degree. And we met in Chicago and married, and she accompanied me. I flew combat after that out of Thailand, and she came to Thailand. That was our first year of marriage. And she convinced me, and after I served additional time for getting a master's degree, I emigrated to Israel. We lived in Israel for 2 years. We have one son that was born here and one son who is a Sabra that was born in Israel, Nimrod. And we had a very good 3 years, but then we returned. But I didn't see, I thought the Israel to me was much more closer in its population than the US. Now, I mean, I'm not very happy about the way things are, and I have no solutions at all. I don't, except that I wish that our politicians would behave differently. I think some of them have been, I don't know, drinking on the side, or I don't know what they've been doing, but it's unfortunate that we can't get together. So I'm not in a position to advise. I don't know. I'm sorry to hear that Israel has these, the situation that you mentioned. So
if I may, I would like to add that I read your article, Professor Agassi, on the global responsibility. And I know that you are worried about the future of humanity, not only the future of Israel.
Certainly.
And I would like to bring an example of a young girl of 16 years old who seems to me to be a leader. And I would like to hear your opinion about it. How can we have more young people like her? I'm speaking, of course, about the Swedish girl who is fighting for environmental friendly behavior. And I wonder if we could do anything to attract more and more young people to worry and do something for the future of humanity. What do you think, Professor Agassi?
I think you're right that this is the question that the future leadership has to tackle. I don't know about this young Swedish girl. She's very sweet and very impressive, and I wish her luck, but I wouldn't call her a leader.
Why?
Because she has not led any program yet. I don't wish to put her down. I think she's wonderful, but to be a leader, you have to have a problem, a solution proposed, and ability to amass people to join you in attempts to implement your solution. She hasn't got any. And again, this is not to put her down, it's just to respond to your question.
Yes.
She may yet turn up to be a leading personality, and she may do things, and I wish she will, but thus far, she only aroused awareness, which is very important, but it is short of activity.
And what is your reaction to that, Professor Cohen?
well, to be a leader, I mean, leadership means leadership is a great thing. You're talking about leadership at the very highest levels, and of course, my thinking is more tactical as far as learning leadership. I mean, and as far as practicing leadership. I mean, certainly you have, what the professor has said is correct, but the techniques of leadership, I mean, leadership is so broad. I mean, I define it almost as a force, which can be for good, but in the military, for example, we speak about force multipliers. That is something that makes the force much stronger. And the leader does that. And yet leadership is so complex that there's not even one way of doing it. I mean, for example, I've seen leaders that are, again, at a much lower level than Professor Agassi has talked about, but who has enabled, who have done tremendous jobs in doing various jobs, either in combat or not in combat, or in the military or not in the military. I mean, my experience as a graduate professor or as a graduate president, you can't lead people in the same way. For example, you can't, as an academic leader, I did not lead the same as in the military, as a military leader. I mean, I would have been very, very unsuccessful had I done so. And even as a military leader, one doesn't always lead in the same fashion. I mean, I recall a book that was, that I read when I was published by the Marine Corps, but it was based on a World War I experience of a individual that was going through infantry school here as a foreign student between Worlds I and II. He had been an officer in the German army during World War I. And he wrote this apparently, or gave this example in our class. And it was so good that this one officer who was going through the same course, a Marine Corps officer, had it published. And he talked about the fact that there was a brigade commander, that is a brigadier general, and he had 3 colonels, and they were ordered to make an attack during World War I. And he said that the general knew his colonels, and he said to Colonel A, who was very much had his own initiative and ran on his own, he only spoke to him and gave him the general idea about what they had to do, and he knew that the guy would do a good job. He said, but Colonel B was very different. Colonel B could do a good job, but he had to know every single detail of the attack that they had planned, and he had to go into great detail. And once he had those details, he would do a great job. But Colonel C, very negative, always negative. And so with Colonel C, he said, he started by saying to him, the higher headquarters that issued us to make this major attack, to take this hill or whatever. And he said, but I don't think we can do it. He said, I don't think we have the resource. I don't think our men are right. And the colonel said to his gentleman, of course we can, sir. We can do it. It's, I think I know how to do it. And so he introduced the attack plan, which had already been done to this colonel as if it was something that he thought couldn't be done, and had this colonel explain to him, oh yes, he could do this job. And the bottom line was all 3 colonels made a successful attack with their men. They commanded regiments of several thousand men each. So this was a very large organization. But leadership is so complex that you never know how the leader is going to lead. And it's a very difficult thing, but it can be a very useful thing. And that's why I say in academia, for example, in the military, but even in the military, you have different people that you're commanding out of different organizations, or different people that you're trying to lead, or different with different people, different organization, different purpose. And so it's not a cookie cutter thing that's done the same way to all. It's done differently. But leadership as a concept, as a force that can do very good or very evil things. I mean, I think I participated last month in your discussion about Hitler and the Holocaust and World War II. And this is a very evil thing. My contention is Hitler lost the war for the Germans. He did this, and I gave the various reasons. So it's a very very complex thing and very difficult. And some are not, now I don't know this individual that you and the professor were talking about whether what this person is, the Swedish girl, I mean, how she led or what she's doing. But I do know that there's different ways of leadership, and one may be a leader and not recognized without further examination about what the abilities are or what the objectives are and so forth. And I just don't know what they are.
So I would like to add that I became a student of Professor Agassi because of his teacher, Karl Popper. And Popper spoke about improvement. So if we don't have a solution to the crisis of leadership, maybe we can find some experiments that we can do in order not to get stuck in the status quo. So, Professor Agassi, do you have some ideas for experiments that could be done in order to improve the status of leadership in the world, which seems to be quite problematic?
Well, leadership expresses itself most when, in a case of emergency, there are disagreements, deep disagreements about how to meet the emergency, and the leader can cut things short and help create a consensus, not in principle and not even theoretically, but practically for the immediate future. And this takes doing, and the leader has to be familiar with the situation, familiar with the potentialities, and able to argue a case quickly and convincingly enough to rally around the forces. And the question is not what he has to do, because it changes from situation to situation, but the ability to find a way to do it. I'll give you an example of one leader who is a person I have nothing else to say in his favor, although he's very famous, and I really can say nothing for him except that he's a great leader, and that is Noam Chomsky, perhaps the most popular academic today. I think his ideas are not important. I think his politics is all wrong, and yet he won the Vietnam War. He wanted to stop the war, and he managed it. So he had great success, and he did it ably. And for this, he deserves recognition. So here's an example.
Who was this guy?
Noam Chomsky, I said again.
Noam Chomsky. He is Noam Chomsky. Noam Chomsky.
Okay. I've not read the materials of Noam, but I am familiar with the individual. Yes.
He's certainly the most famous, the most popular professor alive.
I thought that you were the most popular one, Professor Agassi.
Oh, you flatter me. I don't
Professor
think I
Agassi, I think you
compliment.
include yourself, you mean, when you say that.
But I would like to ask you regarding it. Let's take now a current situation, and let's try to see if we have something to say about it.
I have one current situation that I think takes priority, and that is survival. There is no question that until the end of World War II, no one could threaten the survival of humanity. And yet since World War II, we found a few ways for self-annihilation. And this calls for something like a world government or strengthening of the United Nations organizations. It comes by very many names, but the main thing is a central authority that can command that can lead different nations to cooperate on the problem of survival. If you take even such neighbors as India and Pakistan, who share more than, let's say, India and Britain do, and yet they cannot come to agreement because they each expect the others to do more. This is a fact about the situation in India, and it affects the whole world, but it's really more pertinent in the Indian subcontinent than anywhere else. Now, nobody comes with a suggestion how to make the United Nations organization strong enough to impose authority on the two parties in the Indian subcontinent to force them to come together. The United Nations recommended that students from the Indian subcontinent who study abroad should study politics, social science, and so on, yet they all study physics in order to partake in the making of bombs. And the United Nations could not manage to sway even the students of the subcontinent to improve their contribution to the countries.
So what could we do about it? Nowadays, it seems that the United Nations is only getting weaker. Do you agree, Bill?
Gee, I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's frustrating of the, some decisions the UN makes. They're so, everyone gets biased by their own background in politics, I suppose, what sides they are. And this makes, I think it's very difficult to have, I mean, I don't know about you, but I don't trust the UN. I mean, I am hopeful. I mean, I certainly was hopeful when the first idea about the UN, I mean, when and everything was really great, but it's almost like the League of Nations now, which failed miserably. And I don't know who can we trust as a UN to give such authority to, that they can demand such and such, and that we have to follow these orders. And if we do that, I mean, we all have to listen, and we are told by the UN such and such. But do we accept everything? Do we accept everything that comes down strictly by vote? And I don't know whether that's a good idea or not. I mean, the intent, unfortunately, or fortunately or not, and everyone seems to be for the good. I mean, I think that's true of Indians and Pakistanis. I think it's true of Russians. I think it's true of Israelis. I think it's true of Americans. I think it's true of everyone, even the Palestinians are your enemies right now. I mean, I think they, as from their eyes, it's what they do is the right thing. And that's what makes things so difficult. And I don't know how to solve that kind of problem. I mean, I really don't know how do you do that?
That's really the situation we agree about. You have to mention here that UNICEF has a great success and is perhaps a ray of hope. And the question is, why did UNICEF succeed where the UN failed? And first of all, there's no question that the UN was meant to be more powerful than the League of Nations. You're quite right about it historically. Now, one has to say, what emaciated the United States? And in my opinion, it was the American attitude towards the Korean War. I think the United States during the Korean War destroyed the United Nations organization and any hope in it.
How so? How so? Because I don't understand that.
Just a minute. How so? The United Nations was mobilized to fight as if in the interest of the globe, but it was mobilized in the interest of one side. That's the answer to your question.
Oh, I understand. Very good.
Forgive me. Agassi,
רוצה לעצור רגע?
לא, אני לא יכול, אני אחזור, סליחה.
So I think that if we follow optimism as a must, I would like to ask you, in the spirit of Karl Popper, since it seems that we are stuck and we don't know what the solution should be to the crisis of humanity and the crisis of leadership, then the question is what we could experiment with. And should we teach leadership in kindergarten? Should we attract the best talent to politics in order to make a better leadership in the world and in the countries? What could we do in order to improve, or at least to try and find a way?
I would recommend that we first of all find what is the major obstacle to the rise of powerful leadership. And it seems to me the main thing is when somebody takes the position of a leader and says, after me, either people follow or people don't follow. And then what happens when people don't follow? And this question is not discussed because it's taken for granted that if you do that, you disqualify yourself. And the story of Winston Churchill proves this wrong. He failed as a leader ever since he was 20 years old, really, when he was a journalist in the Boer War. And he described it himself in his marvelous autobiography. And yet, when he got to power during World War II, he excelled as a person, as a politician, as a general. In all directions, he was extremely successful. We were lucky to have him. I don't know how things would have happened if he did not ascend to leadership, which was, let me repeat, a touch and go. So perhaps the first thing we have to do is discuss publicly what is required of a leader and what happens to a leader who has failed. That, I think, is the most important question that we dodge, and we should ask and discuss it.
Well, here's the problems with that.
Thank you.
All leaders fail at some point.
Oh, yes.
Churchill is an excellent example. Churchill failed during World War I as First Lord of the Admiralty and was fired because of his insisting that in the Dardanelles campaign with Gallipoli and so forth, the biggest 200,000 casualties, the largest of any defeat that the Allies suffered. So if we consider only failure, I mean, as a measurement, that's not sufficient, because some of the greatest successes later, and Churchill's an excellent example, had tremendous failures and were fired or otherwise defeated. Churchill had to resign from government and volunteered to serve as lieutenant colonel in the army. I mean, he was a graduate of Sandhurst, and he certainly had the background, and that's what he did. And he was almost killed. His cabin mate was there during an artillery barrage, was blown apart. I mean, he was a great risk, and he was so he built it. I mean, and Churchill, I think, is a tremendous example of what an individual can do in rising after a failure and repeating. But we see these in the industry also. I mean, we see these in the Macy's, for example. You know, Macy's, the guy that founded Macy's, he went to business school, got out, started a company, started a retail store, and it failed. And he started another one, and that one failed also. And he started a third store, and that failed too. And then he started a fourth store, and finally it succeeded. But his first day's income was something like less than $10. And Macy's, well, 150 years later, it's still in existence. In fact, even though it suffered during the pandemic, it took on over 4 million new customers this last year. So I don't know whether failure, I mean, and this is a Drucker thing, and this comes from Drucker because I did not realize it until I became his student. But some of the Drucker said that sometimes failure is the greatest training for later success in anything. And I don't know whether they're training leaders. I mean, you know, I was surprised to learn that in the UK, they did a survey a couple of years ago, and most even college students don't wish to be leaders of any sort, not of companies, not of countries, not of nothing. And people want to, the young people want to avoid leadership. Why? Because of it's a great risk. They don't want to look like they don't know what they're doing, and they don't want people not to like them, you know, a dozen different reasons. And I'm sure the same can be found here. I can't speak for Israel, but as an American, I can certainly say I've seen the same thing with my students here. So I don't know whether leadership is the answer or not. In other words, we can develop leaders. I mean, you know, you can argue whether Hitler was a leader or not, even though he took the title. I mean, not a good leader anyway. I think he was a terrible leader, made big mistakes. But that's but still is just building leaders. Is that the answer? I mean, I'm all for good leaders, by the way, but I don't know if this is going to save the things that Professor Agassi has said, you know, that we're threatened with today, which I have.
You're quite right. You're quite right. Of course, first of all, we know that the best leaders are reluctant leaders. That is to say, they don't serve as leaders because of any ego or any personal need. They serve as leaders because of a sense of commitment. But on the other hand, we don't want to repeat failures. So we want failure to weed out people who don't deserve to be leaders, but who try to be leaders. And on the other hand, we don't want the failure of a true leader to pull them out of the field, as you say. So these are always open questions that don't have solutions that are ready-made. And the question is, how can you find the better solution? And there is no general recipe for that. That is a problem, yes.
Great, yeah. That is a human. Of course, my solution is go to the military. I mean, I started out in the military. I was raised in a military family, an Air Force family, and I went to West Point, which in the United States has a tremendous reputation as a you know, for training leaders. But that doesn't guarantee anything. I mean, there have been, unfortunately, graduates of West Point who've been lousy leaders, terrible leaders.
Quite.
And but even if it is, what are we all supposed to go in the military? Doesn't guarantee anything. And so it's I mean, it's something. Sometimes I look at these kind of issues and I say, and this is why I'm not bothered by them, is I just run away from them. And this is not my thing. I mean, I can't do anything about it. And so I guess I give up. I mean, although I'm terribly torn right now by the problems we're having in the U.S., but I recognize that these problems are worldwide, and there are problems in many countries. And as you say, Professor Agassi, you know, the future of the entire world rests on some of these things. And I don't know the answers. And I don't know, you know, it's not one of the things. I mean, there's some things I think I can control in my own life, or help people in what they're doing to advance their, you know, their own ambitions. But these major issues, you know, I don't know. I feel totally helpless. I don't know. Do you feel, Professor Agassi, how do you feel about these things? I mean, this is.
I feel terrible. as I told you, I don't have solution to the world's problems, except the suggestion that the UN should become stronger, but I have solutions for my country and I can't lead any people to implement them. And the solution I offer is very easy. Sorry.
I agree with almost everything you've said here about these, even though I suspect politically we're probably not the same. But the thing should there be UN be stronger and do these things that you say? I agree. It should be. And can we in our own countries, things be different? Yes. But I don't see what we can. I mean, I'm very frustrated. I don't want to blow anybody up, run around, I just don't know what the answer is at the level or what you do. I mean, terrible situation.
I think
we don't have the options to not at least explore some solutions. So if we don't have solutions, how can we go on exploring them?
Oh, no, it's true. I mean, there are solutions. I mean, I don't know, except as Professor Agassi says, it means accepting ourselves that if we have the solution, then that's what defines and motivates a leader. If I thought that I could influence things in certain ways, then I would, I guess I'd get into politics. That's what, you do nowadays. But I don't have these solutions. I can see
but philosophy, this is why we have such a great conversation between a philosopher and a general. And I think that if we don't have answers, we need to go and look for them and use some of the options how to go about looking for them. And should we go back to Socrates, Professor Agassi?
By all means, the philosophical central difference between the position of a general and a philosopher is very clear. The general does not make a policy. The general implements the military aspect of a given policy, whatever it is, and the only option a general has is to continue or to retire, whereas a philosopher has no such constraint or comfort, whichever you look at it. So my solution is to create different constraints and think pluralistically. That is the only idea that I have that can contribute to the current discussion.
How could we get one example from you regarding this pluralistic approach?
You have to have a problem in order to see how to attack it in a pluralistic way.
Let's take the thing that the two of you have in common. You have both academic background, both, of course, as students and as teachers and as leaders in the academic world. So we need some new leadership, from my perspective, in order to improve the academy. What can we do about that?
The difference between the academy and practice is very clear. A professor doesn't have to convince anybody, doesn't have to motivate anybody. A professor has to present the most attractive question and the most attractive answers and discuss them and compare them and so on. This is a very well-trodden territory. This is not true of given systems where the framework is given and the instruction is given within the framework, and then you are constrained. And so this is both a blessing and a curse.
So maybe in order to save humanity, we need to create more collaboration between
Exactly.
the academia and the practice.
Exactly. So I agree fully.
Yeah,
And
this is always
not,
a good idea. But, you know, even leadership, though, you know, Drucker used to say, he wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal once. He used to have a monthly column, or maybe it was a weekly column in the Wall Street Journal for 10 or 12 years. And one article he wrote about the fact that he had been asked to speak by some organization on the latest techniques in leadership, or the latest leadership, cutting edge leadership. And he said, nothing has changed in the last 2,000 years about leadership. He said the ancients knew leadership. And he went on, I mean, later on, I mean, as a student, I learned that this is true. His favorite book on leadership was by Xenophon. And he said, you know, Xenophon wrote this book 2,000 years ago. He said it was the first systematic book on leadership, and still the best. So naturally, I ran off to read Xenophon immediately. And Xenophon wrote a book called The Education of Cyrus the Great. And I think it was kind of a metaphor. I mean, I don't think he actually knew, because he lived several hundred years after Cyrus the Great. But he did have this, and I read the chapter on his, or I read this book on the education. And in one part in the book, he said that Xenophon, or that Cyrus the Great rather, asked his father, how can I learn to lead men in battle the best? Or maybe his father asked him that question. And he said, you can, he said, and Cyrus the Great, who was not the great then, but simply an 18-year-old boy, said, easy, father, I reward those that do well, and I punish those that don't obey my orders. And his father said, well, it's true that might work in a lot of situations, but in the most dire situations in battle, that's not going to work. And he said, but there is one way that would help. Now, in modern terms, we'd say, you know, this is servant leadership. What he said was, you must lead your men better than and take care of them better than they can possibly take care of themselves. And if you do this in the most difficult situations, they will follow you. I don't know whether you agree with that, Professor Agassi, but that's what Xenophon said anyway.
What Xenophon said is very important, but let me say, I think there are later thinkers who have to be thought about. And the most important, in my opinion, is Machiavelli. The ideas
he was
of
such a nasty guy, though. It's true, he wrote a book, and he wrote The Prince. It was written for not only for military leaders, but for all political leaders also.
That's right.
I don't know. That's a good question, though. What, you know, should, you know, you as a good, quote, well, I guess in quotes, good leader, should you should we always be telling the truth, or should a good leader lie? I mean, the question being, for example, if a bad situation is known, should you tell those that you want those that are following you the truth, or in in their interest, should you lie to them? And I've often pondered that. I come out in favor of telling the truth because I was taught that. I mean, from at West Point, for example, you know, that the ethics and your ability to be an ethical leader and telling the truth was more important than success. But it's true, maybe you don't do that and you lose, or you do that and you lose the battle or something. But I've seen situations where someone lied for the interest of the situation, and I was always angry when I found out what it was. So I come down and on side of tell the truth and let's make the best of what we can. And I don't know how you feel about that, but you know that
I feel about it very simply that leaders need very much a high level of credibility, and that requires truthfulness through thick and thin. And you are judged by harsh situations, and how do you manage about lying? And if you lie, you lose credibility, and very seriously. And they don't say, oh, there was a failing moment, was a hard moment. It's very funny. There was a famous slogan of President Reagan, we don't negotiate with terrorists. And then when there was a hijack, he negotiated with terrorists, and he said, these are hard times, which I found very funny because one talks only about hard times in this context. So I found it amusing. I found a number of times that politicians try to get out of a narrow situation by some irrelevancies or fibs and so on. And I felt they always paid too dearly for it.
I think you're absolutely 100% correct. I mean,
Thank you.
even as a young officer, I mean, I was told to by my commander to cheat to make us look better when I exercise.
Mhm.
I came and I mean, I was contrary to everything I had been taught at West Point. And it was the worst time I ever had it. I had about 4 or 5 days before I had to make, before we had to plan this mission. And it was terrible for me because I asked I was lieutenant, and I asked other lieutenants, I said, oh, everybody cheats from now and then. You have to. And it was not what I was taught. I was absolutely, I mean, it really upset me. And I had worse time than ever I had in combat, by the way.
Yeah.
And then there came the day when we got together to plan the mission, and it was always planned around the position I was holding then. And I asked to speak to him in private. And I said, sir, he was lieutenant colonel and I was lieutenant. I said, if you want to, and I thought I was ending my career, frankly, I really did. And I wondered what my parents were going to say. And I didn't know what I was going to do because I didn't want to do anything else in life. I had spent 6 years, 4 years at West Point, 2 years of flight training, horrible, horrible experience. And I said, look, Colonel, if you want to do this, I was a navigator of a B-52 nuclear bomber. I said, if you want to do this, you can go ahead and do it. Get yourself a new navigator because I'm not going to do it. And this guy exploded. I mean, I'm 5'8". This guy is 6'2". He's a lieutenant colonel and I'm a lieutenant. He's in all kinds of combat and everything else from World War II. And this was my first crew, the first time I ever flown. And this little pipsqueak was telling him that he was going to disobey a direct order. And he tried to convince me. He was very upset. We were in a little room and I left the room and he slammed the door and left. And I was literally shaking in my boots. I mean, I didn't know what to do. I used to smoke in those days, when we had our cigarettes up here and I lit it up, I was shaking, but I wasn't going to do it. I just flat wasn't going to do it. And I went back and for about an hour, we continued to plan the mission and it was very difficult, but went on. And then after about an hour, he said, Lieutenant Cohen, I want to talk to you alone again. So we got in the room. He says, okay, he says, you won't cheat, but those missiles better be reliable. And I said, sir, I will do everything I can to make them reliable, but I'm not going to cheat.
That's lovely. Thank you.
I did it. Now, I don't know whether they.
Yes.
My radar.
Prof.
He was a senior ranking guy who flew with me downstairs, and he was a navigator too, but he was a navigator bombardier. And this guy was a lieutenant colonel. They the same rank as a pilot, and he was. I didn't know what I was gonna. I really didn't know what I was gonna do. But at any rate, I figured that. At first, they were reliable, and at first I thought, man, if I got the skill, or then I realized, nah, it wasn't that. I was just dumb and lucky. These things, and later on, I thought these two lieutenant colonels, they could have figured out a way to get around. So I didn't know whether they were cheating or not, and they could have done that. But the one thing I knew is that I knew me from that. I knew how far I would go for what I believed to be right, and that was all the way. And I knew that, and I think they knew it too from then on. I got a lot more respect, even though I was a brand new lieutenant. And but I believe that. I absolutely believe it. I mean, I think that's essential. You know, you gotta have integrity, or don't do this kind of stuff. Got too much responsibility. Don't do it.
That's right.
So anyway,
I suggest that we try to get closer to the end and find some checkout remarks that will make us a little more optimistic, because we talked about very tough issues today, and we need to finish with some optimism. So let me ask you, Professor Agassi, do you have some optimistic checkout remarks for...
Certainly. The fact that we
Yes.
largely agree, although we come from so different places and attitudes and angles, this is very encouraging.
and I have to
Thank
say
you.
that, and I say the same thing. I feel very good about our
Thank you.
discussion.
Thank you.
So I would like to thank both of you very much, and to say where there is no answer, at least we need to carry on the conversation and to explore all kinds of options, how to find answers. We talked about the future of Israel and the future of humanity. And we all believe that we need leaders in order to improve our situation. And you are both leaders, and I appreciate the fact that you joined us here. And I wish you all the best, because we need to carry on with these conversations. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Professor Agassi. It's nice meeting you.
Thank you. Thank you very
Okay.
much.
Good
Same
to see
here.
you again.
Thank you.
You bet.